My mother called me on the morning of my 32nd birthday. Not to say happy birthday. Not to ask how I was doing. She called because she'd heard through my Aunt Patricia that I'd turned down a second date with a man named Gerald Whitmore, a 58-year-old commercial real estate developer with a boat, a summer house in the Hamptons, and apparently 3 ex-wives who all received very generous settlements. "Do you have any idea," my mother said before I even got the word hello fully out of my mouth, "what you just threw away?" I held the phone away from my ear and stared at the ceiling of my apartment. My apartment. The one I'd bought myself. The one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the little balcony where I grew tomatoes in the summer. I thought about all the years that had led to this moment. All the Sunday dinners where I sat quietly while my family mapped out my future like I was a chess piece they owned. All the times I smiled and nodded and told myself they meant well. All the times I believed them. "Mom," I said, putting the phone back to my ear, my voice perfectly calm. "I think you should know something." I let the pause hang there, long and deliberate. "I don't need Gerald Whitmore. I don't need anyone you pick for me. And after today, I'm going to need you to stop calling me about this. Or stop calling me at all." She gasped like I'd said something obscene. This is the story of how my family spent 20 years trying to sell me to the highest bidder, and how I spent those same 20 years quietly building something they never saw coming. My name is Nadia. I grew up in a mid-sized city in Ohio, the second of 3 children. My father, Raymond, worked in insurance. My mother, Carolyn, did not work, at least not in any way she ever counted. She managed the house, managed the social calendar, and managed, above all else, the family's image. We were not wealthy. We were what my mother called well-positioned. There's a difference, apparently. Being well-positioned means you drive a car that's slightly beyond your means, you belong to the right church, you send Christmas cards with a professional photo, and you talk about money constantly without ever admitting you don't have enough of it. My older brother, Derek, was the golden child. He was charming, athletic, and could do no wrong. When Derek got a DUI at 22, my father called in a favor and it disappeared. When Derek dropped out of his MBA program, my mother told the extended family he was pursuing entrepreneurial ventures. When Derek borrowed $8,000 from my parents and never paid it back, no one mentioned it. Not once. My younger sister, Bree, was the baby, which meant she was precious, protected, and perpetually excused. Bree was pretty in a way my mother appreciated, the kind of conventionally attractive that my mother believed was a woman's most transferable asset. Bree knew it too. She learned early that tears and a soft voice could dissolve most consequences. And then there was me. I was the capable one. Which sounds like a compliment, but in my family it was a job description. I got good grades because no one was going to help me if I didn't. I saved my own money for a laptop at 16 because my father said, "You're smart enough to figure it out." I applied to college on my own, filled out my own financial aid forms, drove myself to orientation while my mother flew to New York with Derek to help him settle into his apartment, the apartment she and my father were paying for. I didn't complain. That was the rule, unspoken but absolute. Nadia doesn't complain. Nadia handles things. But here's what I noticed, even back then. My mother's plan for Derek was that he'd find himself, and eventually land somewhere respectable. Her plan for Bree was a good marriage, to someone established, someone with money and prospects. And her plan for me, same as Bree's, only more urgent, because, according to my mother, I was less soft, less immediately appealing in the way she understood appealing. I was sharp and quiet, and I made people feel slightly observed, which made her nervous. So she decided the solution was simple. I needed to be married off before anyone looked too closely. That plan started when I was 19 years old. The first time my mother tried to arrange my life around a man's bank account, I thought it was an accident. She invited me home for Easter my sophomore year of college, and there was a man at the table I didn't know. 40-something, gray at the temples, a friend of my father's from the insurance industry. His name was Frank. He was divorced. My mother had seated him next to me and kept touching my arm and saying things like, "Nadia's studying business, Frank. Isn't that impressive?" With a smile that meant she's practical and pleasant. What a find. I was 20 years old. Frank was 44. I excused myself after dinner and told my mother in the kitchen that I wasn't interested in being set up with her friends. She looked at me like I'd said something bewildering. "I'm not setting you up," she said. "I'm just introducing you to people. That's how the world works, Nadia. You meet someone, you make a connection. That's how your father and I. Dad was 26 when you met him, Mom." She smiled tightly. "Frank is very successful." I went back to school the next morning and told myself it was a one-time thing. It wasn't. Over the next several years, there was a parade of men my mother found suitable. A dentist who owned 3 practices. A widower from our church who was 61 and very young at heart. A man named Todd whose father owned a chain of car dealerships. She'd mention them casually, plant seeds, send emails with LinkedIn profiles attached. She actually did that twice. And when I showed no interest, the conversation would shift from gentle suggestion to something sharper. "You're too picky," she'd say. Or, "You think you're going to find someone better with that attitude." Or the one that cut deepest. "Bree's already seeing someone serious. You're not getting any younger, Nadia." Bree was 23 at the time. I was 26. I had just started my first real job at a financial consulting firm, working 60-hour weeks, learning everything I could about investment strategy, quietly squirreling money into a brokerage account I'd opened on my own. But my mother didn't see any of that. She saw a daughter who wasn't yet attached to a man with money, and in her mind that meant I was failing. The worst incident before the real breaking point came on Bree's wedding day. Bree had met Marcus through a friend of my mother's. Naturally. Marcus was fine. He was kind honestly, and he worked in pharmaceutical sales and made good money. My mother was thrilled. She threw herself into the wedding with an energy I had never once seen her direct toward anything I did. I was the maid of honor. I organized the bachelorette weekend, coordinated with vendors, kept my mother from having a breakdown about the centerpieces 3 separate times. The morning of the wedding, while I was helping Bree into her dress, my mother came in and looked at us both. She looked at Bree first, and her face was pure joy. Then she looked at me. "You know," she said almost absently, "Marcus has a colleague. Single. Good income. I'll introduce you at the reception." I kept my hand steady on Bree's zipper. Bree caught my eye in the mirror. She had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Not today, Mom," I said. "Why not? You're dressed nicely. You look fine today." "Fine. Not beautiful. Not lovely. Fine." I pulled the zipper up, smiled at Bree in the mirror, said nothing else. But inside something quietly cracked. The actual breaking point came 14 months later at Thanksgiving. I was 29. I had been promoted twice at the firm. I was managing a small team and I had started very quietly, doing my own trades on the side. Nothing aggressive, nothing reckless, just a careful, methodical portfolio I'd been building for 5 years. I hadn't told my family any of this because I'd learned over time that information was currency in my family. What you told them, they used. That Thanksgiving, I arrived at my parents' house to find Gerald Whitmore at the table. Gerald Whitmore, who I had never met, never agreed to meet, never been warned about. Gerald Whitmore, who was my mother's latest candidate. A real estate developer, recently divorced, who apparently played golf with a man who went to church with my parents' neighbor. Gerald Whitmore, who was seated next to me, who had clearly been briefed on me, and who spent the first 20 minutes of dinner asking me leading questions while my mother watched from across the table with barely concealed delight. Got through dinner. Helped clean up. I waited until Bree and Marcus had left and Derek had fallen asleep in front of the TV, and then I found my mother in the kitchen and I said quietly, "You need to tell me the truth. Is this what you think of me? That my entire purpose is to find a man with money?" She didn't deny it. That was what I hadn't expected, that she just wouldn't deny it. "I think," she said, folding a dish towel with careful precision, "that you are 30 years old. 29. And you are spending your best years chasing a career that will not love you back. I think that you are difficult and that you have high standards that are frankly not supported by your circumstances. And I think that Gerald is a lovely man who could give you a life I have not been able to give you. She set the dish towel on the counter. "I'm doing this because I love you." I stood there for a moment. I looked at her face, at the absolute certainty there, at the way she believed with her whole self that she was helping me. "My circumstances," I repeated. "Yes." I picked up my coat. I said, "Thank you for dinner." And I walked out. I sat in my car in their driveway for a long time. The porch light was on. Inside I could see the kitchen light, my mother still moving around. My circumstances. She had no idea what my circumstances were. She never asked. She never thought to ask. She had written her story about me so long ago that she'd stopped looking at the actual pages. In that car, in that driveway, something settled into place inside me like a lock clicking shut. I wasn't angry anymore. I was decided. I was going to make something so undeniable that she'd have no choice but to see it. Here's what my mother didn't know about my circumstances. She didn't know that over 7 years of careful, compulsive saving and investing, I had accumulated a personal portfolio worth just over $400,000. She didn't know that I had been offered, and had quietly accepted, an equity stake in a small fintech startup I'd been advising informally. She didn't know that the startup had just closed its series of funding round, which meant my stake, modest as it was now worth significantly more on paper. She didn't know I had spent the last 18 months building a financial literacy platform in my evenings, a subscription-based app for first-generation investors that had recently crossed 8,000 paid subscribers. She didn't know any of this because I hadn't told her. I'd learned not to tell her things she would then try to redirect toward the nearest eligible bachelor. But after that Thanksgiving I stopped being passive about it. I stopped coasting. I started treating my financial future like a project with a deadline. I called a financial advisor I'd met at a conference, a woman named Priya who had a reputation for working with early career investors who wanted to build aggressively but responsibly. I laid out everything: the portfolio, the startup equity, the app. She looked at my numbers for a long moment and then looked up at me and said, "Why are you not managing money professionally?" I told her I was thinking about it. "Think faster," she said. I also, for the first time, talked to a lawyer. Not about my family. There was nothing legal to pursue there. But about the app. About intellectual property. About what it would look like to spin it off into its own LLC. The lawyer I met with, a sharp woman named Deborah who charged $700 an hour and was worth every cent, told me I had more leverage than I realized. "You've been doing everything right," Deborah said. "You just haven't claimed it yet." That phrase stayed with me. I had been doing everything right. I had been working and saving and building in the background while my family looked at me and saw someone failing to accomplish the one task they'd assigned me. And I hadn't claimed it. I hadn't stood in it. I'd kept it small and quiet and hidden, partly out of habit, partly because some piece of me had absorbed their skepticism and made it my own. I stopped doing that after Thanksgiving. Over the next 8 months I filed the LLC. I hired a small team, a developer, a marketing consultant, a customer service manager. I rebranded the app, got a feature in a financial trade publication, and watched the subscriber count climb past 20,000. I negotiated my salary at the firm to reflect my actual contribution. I started saying my goals out loud instead of keeping them folded in the back of my chest like a secret. And I started talking less to my family. Not angrily. Not dramatically. I just stopped calling every Sunday. Stopped showing up to the dinners where I knew I'd be seated next to someone's eligible colleague. Stopped performing the version of myself that fit their frame. My mother noticed. She left 3 voicemails over 2 months, each one slightly more agitated than the last. The third one said, "I don't know what your problem is, but your silence is very hurtful." I listened to it twice. Then I saved it. I don't know why. Maybe I knew I'd want to remember what that felt like. The way she framed her discomfort as my transgression. About a year after that Thanksgiving, the fintech startup I had a stake in was acquired. I will not tell you the number. What I will tell you is that it was the kind of number that changes the sentence structure of your life. The kind that rearranges the furniture of your future so thoroughly that you have to sit quietly for several days just to figure out where everything now stands. Called Priya. We talked for 2 hours. Called Deborah. We talked about tax strategy and reinvestment and what I wanted the next 5 years to look like. I went for a long walk around my neighborhood, past the coffee shop where I wrote the first version of the app's business plan, past the library where I'd spent Saturday mornings in my 20s reading everything I could about index funds and venture capital and compound interest. I bought myself flowers. That sounds small, but it felt significant. I bought myself the most extravagant, ridiculous bouquet the shop had. Lilies and peonies and some flower I didn't know the name of, all of it bright and completely over the top, and I put it on my kitchen table and I sat with it and I thought, you did this. I didn't tell my family. I did, however, make one change they would eventually notice. I resigned from the consulting firm. Politely, gratefully, with 2 months' notice and a genuine thank you to the colleagues who had been good to me. I was going to run the app full-time. That was the plan. When my mother heard through the family grapevine that I'd left my job, she called immediately. You quit. Her voice had that particular tightness it got when she was trying to sound calm. Nadia, you quit your job. I did. To do what? To run my company. Silence. What company? And there it was. The moment I had been, I realized, building toward for years without consciously knowing it. She didn't know. She didn't even know it existed. For all the time she had talked over me, redirected me, introduced me to wealthy men as though I were a problem she was trying to solve with someone else's money. She hadn't known. She hadn't been paying attention. I have an app, I said. A financial education platform. I've had it for 2 years. I just acquired enough capital to run it full-time. Another silence. Longer. Capital, she repeated. What does that mean? It means I have money, Mom. I heard her breathing. I heard the specific quality of confusion when a person's mental model of you is colliding with information it can't accommodate. How much money? She finally asked. And I said very gently. Enough. The confrontation I had been unconsciously preparing for my entire adult life happened on a Saturday in March, at my parents' house. Over coffee I had not particularly wanted. My mother had called and asked me to come. She said she wanted to clear the air. My father said he thought it would be good if we all talked. Derek was there. I hadn't expected Derek, but of course Derek was there, because Derek smelled money from 100 miles and had decided, apparently, that family warmth was suddenly important. I drove over. I wore a blazer I liked. I was calm in the way that you can only be calm when you have already decided that the outcome of the conversation doesn't threaten anything you actually need. We sat in the living room. My mother had made coffee and set out the good cups. The china ones she only used when she wanted someone to feel that something significant was happening. My father sat in his armchair. Derek was on the couch, one ankle crossed over his knee, wearing that easy smile he'd been wearing since childhood. The one that meant I'm comfortable here, I always get what I want here. My mother started with the reframe. That was her move. Lead with warmth so you can't call it an attack. We're just so proud of you, she said. We always knew you were capable. I wrapped my hands around my cup. You did. Of course. She smiled. You've always been our dependable one. I let that sit for a moment. Dependable. The word she'd always used when what she meant was useful. Mom, I said, why did you ask me to come today? She glanced at my father. He glanced at Derek. Derek leaned forward. Look, Nadia, we're family. And we've been hearing things about your business, about the acquisition thing, and we just want to be in your corner. You know. Like we've always been. There it was. The acquisition, I said. Yeah. He smiled wider. I mean, that's incredible. That's huge. We want to celebrate you. I looked at my brother for a long moment. This man who had been handed every soft landing my family could construct. Who had borrowed money and never returned it. Who had never once called to ask how my week was going. Who had never shown up. Who I could count on one hand the times he had treated me like a person rather than a background character in the story of his own life. You want to celebrate me, I said. Absolutely. I mean, look, I've actually been thinking about getting into some investment stuff myself, and I thought maybe you could. No, I said. He blinked. What? No, Derek. I'm not going to be your investment resource. His smile flickered. I'm not asking you to. You are. I said, still calm, still quiet. That's exactly what you're doing. And I want to say something to all of you. And I want to say it clearly so there's no confusion later about what I meant. My mother's face had gone very still. I love you, I said. I want to say that first because it's true and because what I'm about to say isn't about anger. I'm not angry anymore. I was for a long time. But I'm not now. I set down my coffee cup. For most of my life, you treated me like a liability you were trying to offload. You set me up with men I didn't know and didn't want. You called my standards unrealistic. You told me my circumstances didn't support who I thought I was. You never once asked me what I was building. You never looked. I know you thought you were helping. I know, Mom, that you believed if I could just attach myself to someone with money, I'd be safe. But what you didn't see, what you couldn't see because you weren't looking, is that I was already building safety. I was building it myself, the whole time, quietly, while you were focused on finding someone else to hand me to. The room was very quiet. My father was looking at the floor. Derek had lost the smile entirely. My mother's eyes had gone bright. Nadia, I never meant. I know, I said. And I meant it. But here's what I need you to understand. I don't need the apology tour. I'm not here to extract a confession. I came today because you asked me to, and because I wanted to say this out loud in person so that we can all move forward without pretending the past was something it wasn't. I looked around the room. I built a company. I made investments. I have more financial stability right now than I think any of you realize. And I built all of it on my own, without a wealthy husband, without family money, without any of the things you told me I needed. Pause. And I want you to think about what that means. About what you were telling me all those years about who I was and what I was capable of. My mother was crying now, quietly, her hands in her lap. Are you saying you don't want to see us anymore? She asked, her voice small. I'm saying I want something different. I want to come to a dinner where no one is seated next to me as a candidate. I want to call and have the conversation be about something other than my marital status. I want to be seen as a whole person, not a problem to solve. I stood up. I'm willing to try that if you are. Derek opened his mouth. I looked at him. Not today, Derek, I said. Whatever you need financially, the answer is no. That can change over time, but not today. Picked up my jacket. I hugged my mother, who was still crying. I nodded to my father, who gave me a long, strange look. Something almost like respect, though it was so unfamiliar on his face I almost didn't recognize it. I walked out. I sat in my car for a moment. It was a gray March day, the trees still bare, the sky the color of old pewter. Thought I might cry. I waited for it. But what came instead was something lighter, a loosening like a coat I'd been wearing indoors for too long finally coming off. The months after that conversation were, by any measure, strange. My mother did not call for 3 weeks. When she did, she asked about the app. She asked carefully, awkwardly, the way you ask about something you know you should have asked about years ago. I told her. She listened. She didn't say she was proud, she wasn't quite there yet, but she listened, and that was new. Derek did not take the no gracefully. He tried twice more, once through my mother, once through a text that said just lunch, no agenda, which was so transparent it almost made me laugh. I didn't respond. His wife left him 8 months later, and I heard from Bree that a lot of their financial problems came down to him living beyond their means for years. I felt the sad, particular ache of watching someone suffer consequences they entirely authored for themselves. I didn't reach out. It wasn't mine to fix. My father surprised me. He called me one afternoon out of nowhere and said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About us not looking." He stopped. Started again. "I'm sorry we didn't look." It wasn't a long speech. It wasn't elaborate. But it was the first time in my life Raymond had apologized to me for anything, and I sat with that for a long time afterward. Bree, to her credit, came around the quickest. She took me to dinner and said, "I always knew you were going to do something like this. I just didn't know how to say it without Mom getting upset." I paused. I should have said it anyway. We've gotten closer since then. She's become someone I actually call. The app reached 50,000 subscribers the following year. I was profiled in a financial magazine. A real one, the kind that had been on my parents' coffee table throughout my childhood, the kind that symbolized to my mother a certain kind of arrival. She framed the article. She put it in their hallway. The first time I saw it there, I stood in front of it for a long moment. I didn't know how to feel. I still don't entirely. There's a version of me that wanted to feel triumphant, and I did a little. But there was another version of me that just felt tired and tender in the way you feel when something long braced for finally, gently resolves. Gerald Whitmore, for what it's worth, was later involved in a messy public lawsuit over a commercial property dispute. My mother never mentioned him again. Part 9. Reflection and Closure. It's been 3 years since that Saturday in March. My life looks like nothing I was told to want and everything I actually needed. I have a company I'm proud of, a team I genuinely like, work that makes me feel alive in the morning. I have a small apartment I upgraded finally, with a balcony where I still grow tomatoes in the summer. I have friendships that are deep and unchoreographed. I have a person in my life, someone I met at a conference, someone who asked about my work before asking about anything else, someone who has never once made me feel like a problem to be solved. My mother and I talk on Sundays now. Not every Sunday, but most of them. The conversations are still sometimes awkward, still sometimes edged with old patterns that haven't fully dissolved. She still occasionally says things that make me have to close my eyes for a moment. But she's trying. I think she genuinely is. I've thought a lot about what I would tell a younger version of myself. The 20-year-old at Easter dinner with a strange man seated next to her, or the 26-year-old filing her own taxes alone and telling herself it was fine. I think I'd say, the people who love you badly are not always lying about the love. Some of them genuinely believe the story they're telling. That doesn't mean the story is true. That doesn't mean you have to live inside it. And I'd say build the thing. Whatever the thing is, the company, the portfolio, the life that looks nothing like what they imagined for you. Build it quietly and completely and let it speak when you're ready. I was told for most of my life that my circumstances wouldn't support who I thought I was. That I needed someone else's resources to become real. I found out that wasn't true. I was the resource. I always had been.